Chapter 1: The Man Without a Room. Carson Green stood in the hallway of his own house like a guest who had forgotten why he'd come. He wasn't holding anything. That was the strange part. He'd walked there with purpose. He was sure of it. But somewhere between the kitchen and the narrow bend in the hallway where the floorboards creaked if you stepped too close to the wall, the purpose had slipped quietly out of his grasp. Now he stood there, hands empty, staring at a framed photograph of his family taken years ago in front of the house. In the picture, the paint behind them had still been uneven. He remembered that. He'd spent a long weekend up a ladder trying to get the siding just right, his wife laughing every time he swore under his breath. Kevin had been small enough to sit on his shoulders. His daughter, Emily, had clung to his wife's leg with one hand and waved with the other. They all looked sunburned and happy. "Dad!" The voice snapped him back. Carson turned his head toward the staircase where Kevin stood halfway down, one thumb still tapping rapidly on his phone. "Yeah," Carson said, automatically straightening a little. Kevin hesitated, as though considering whether the question was worth finishing. "Was there, something you needed?" Carson blinked. "No. I mean, yeah, probably." He glanced around, hoping something in the walls would remind him. "I just forgot what it was." Kevin nodded, already losing interest. "Okay." He turned and climbed back up the stairs without another word, his steps quiet, practiced. Carson watched him go, then looked back at the photograph. "I used to know exactly what I was doing," he muttered. From the living room, his wife's voice carried clearly. "Carson, can you check the sink? It's making that noise again." "Yeah," he called without thinking. It took him a second to realize he hadn't actually heard any noise. The kitchen sink wasn't making a sound when he got there. Carson stood in front of it anyway, staring down into the empty basin as though it might confess something if he waited long enough. He turned the faucet on. Water rushed out, normal and unremarkable. "Seems fine," he said. From the living room, a pause. Then, that's weird. It was definitely doing it earlier." Carson turned the faucet off. "Maybe it stopped." "Maybe," she said. He dried his hands on a dish towel that didn't belong there. Emily must have brought it in earlier, probably without realizing, and leaned back against the counter. For a moment, the house was quiet in that particular way that old homes could manage, where the silence had its own texture. A soft settling, the faint hum of unseen pipes, the distant murmur of Kevin's voice upstairs, speaking to an audience Carson had never met. Carson glanced toward the basement door. It was closed. That wasn't unusual. It had been closed a lot lately. Still, he walked over and opened it just enough to peer down the dim stairs. Light spilled up from below, bright and artificial, and he could hear voices. Emily's animated and quick, and at least one other layered with it through speakers. "And I'm telling you, the character design in Season 2 makes no sense," Emily was saying. "Like, they just forgot what they were doing." Carson stepped back and gently shut the door. "Everything okay?" his wife asked from the doorway. He turned. "Yeah, I just thought I heard something." She smiled faintly, distracted, her phone in her hand. "It's Emily's live stream. They've been at it for an hour already. She said she might go longer tonight." "Right?" Carson said. His wife lingered for a moment, like she might say something else, but then her phone buzzed and she glanced down at it. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," she said absently. "Claire texted me." "Okay." The back door opened, closed. Carson stood in the kitchen alone. He looked around slowly, taking inventory in a way he hadn't before. Not really. The counters were clean, because he'd wiped them down an hour ago. The fridge had magnets from family trips that felt further away than they should have. The table bore the faint scratches from years of homework, meals, and projects. Nothing about it was unfamiliar. And yet, Carson pushed away from the counter and wandered back into the hallway. He stopped at the room that had once been his office. The door was open. Inside, shelves lined the walls, neatly arranged with craft supplies, fabrics, tools he couldn't name. The desk he had once used was gone, replaced by a wide table cluttered with half-finished projects. The window was open, letting in a soft breeze that stirred the edges of colorful materials. It was undeniably nice. It just wasn't his. He didn't linger long. Upstairs, he passed Kevin's room. The door was cracked open, and Carson could hear him speaking in a quick, easy rhythm that didn't resemble how he spoke at the dinner table. No, that play was terrible. What are you doing?" "Oh my. Guys, you seeing this?" Carson paused, listening. There was laughter, Kevin's, but looser, brighter. Carson smiled faintly, even as something tugged quietly at his chest. He continued down the hall to his bedroom. Their bedroom. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Not all the way, just enough to soften the noise from the rest of the house. The room was tidy, the bed made. His wife's things were arranged exactly how she liked them. Books stacked on her side table, a soft lamp casting warm light. Carson sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he just stared at his hands. Then he leaned back, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't one single thing. He realized that now. It wasn't the basement or the office or the hallway where he forgot why he'd been walking. It was all of it. A slow giving piece by piece until there was nothing left to give, but also nothing left that was his. Carson sat up again. That's not great, he said aloud, the understatement making him huff a quiet laugh. From downstairs, Emily's voice rose again, animated and confident. Kevin's laughter echoed faintly through the ceiling. Outside, his wife spoke on the phone, her tone warm and easy. Their lives were full. They were happy. Carson knew that. And yet, he stood, crossed to the small dresser and opened a drawer. Inside, beneath neatly folded clothes, was an old sketchbook he hadn't touched in years. He pulled it out slowly, dusting the cover with his thumb. He flipped it open. The first few pages were rough, half-finished ideas, stray lines, but then, gradually, the drawings sharpened. Designs, concepts, things he had once imagined building, creating, pursuing. Carson smiled, felt unfamiliar. That, more than anything else, made him pause. "Ha!" he said softly. Downstairs, someone laughed again, loud and bright. Carson closed the sketchbook gently and held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked toward the door. "I'm going to need a room," he said. He didn't know how yet. He didn't know when. But for the first time in a long while, the thought didn't feel like something he owed. It felt like something he wanted. Chapter 2, The Unlikely Hobby. Carson Green didn't make an announcement. He didn't gather the family at the dinner table or clear his throat for emphasis. There was no speech, no declaration of intent, no formal reclaiming of lost ground. That would have required a kind of certainty he hadn't quite found yet. Instead, he started on a Tuesday. Specifically, he started at 6:30 in the evening after dinner, after the dishes were done. Because of course they were. And after Kevin had retreated upstairs with his headset and Emily had disappeared into the basement with a shout of, "We're going live in 5. Carson stood in the kitchen alone again, holding the sketchbook. He turned it over in his hands like it was something fragile, or maybe something slightly dangerous. "You're just paper," he told it. The sketchbook, unsurprisingly, offered no rebuttal. From the living room, the faint murmur of the television drifted in, though no one was actually watching it. His wife had turned it on out of habit before stepping out back again. Another call, another conversation Carson wasn't part of. He didn't begrudge her that. Not exactly. Still, he tucked the sketchbook under his arm and walked toward the garage. The door stuck slightly when he opened it, the wood swelling from years of Midwest summers and winters arguing with each other. He pushed a little harder until it gave with a soft pop, revealing the familiar clutter of tools, storage bins, and the smell of old sawdust and motor oil. Carson stepped inside and flipped on the overhead light. "Okay," he said to no one in particular. The garage wasn't much. It had never been much. Over time, it had become a holding place for things that didn't belong anywhere else. Holiday decorations, half-used paint cans, a ladder that squeaked ominously if you leaned it too far to the left. But there, along the far wall, half buried beneath a tarp, sat something Carson hadn't really looked at in years. He crossed the space slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal, and pulled the tarp back. A workbench, not a particularly impressive one. The surface was worn uneven, stained in places with things Carson couldn't quite identify anymore. One leg had a small shim wedged beneath it to keep it from wobbling. "I remember you," Carson said, a hint of amusement slipping in. He ran his hand across the surface, feeling the rough patches, the grooves left behind from projects that had never quite been finished. Back when they first bought the house, he'd spent more time out here. He'd built shelves, fixed cabinets, started, though not completed, a small coffee table that had eventually been replaced by something purchased online after a particularly long week. Life had a way of doing that, replacing the unfinished with the easier. Carson set the sketchbook down and opened it again, flipping through the pages until he found one that made him pause. It was a design for a simple wooden bench. Nothing elaborate, just clean lines, sturdy legs, and a small shelf beneath the seat. Functional, solid, doable. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at the workbench, then back at the drawing. "Well," he said, "that seems inconvenient." His tools were not organized. That was the polite way of putting it. Carson spent the next 40 minutes rediscovering where things had migrated over the years. The hammer turned up inside a plastic bin labeled winter cords. The tape measure emerged from beneath a stack of old gardening gloves. The saw took longer, requiring him to move 3 boxes, a folding chair, and something that might have been a broken humidifier. By the time he gathered what he needed, he was sweating lightly and breathing a little harder than he'd expected. "Out of practice," he muttered. He set the tools down carefully. For a moment, he just stood there again. The garage hummed softly around him, the light buzzing faintly overhead. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car passed, tires whispering along the quiet street. Then, from the house, faint but unmistakable, Emily's voice carried through the open door. "And this is why I'm saying he doesn't get it. Like he's trying, but he doesn't get it." Carson winced slightly. "No offense to dads," she added quickly, and someone, her friend presumably, laughed. Carson looked down at the sketchbook. "Well," he said, "that's fair." He picked up the tape measure. The first cut was not perfect. Carson stared at the piece of wood, then at the line he'd drawn, then back at the cut. "That's close," he decided. He adjusted, tried again, and this time it was better. Not perfect, but better. Okay, he said more firmly. Time passed in small, quiet increments. Measured. Literal inches of progress. The rhythm came back slowly. The feel of the tools in his hands, the focus required to make something align, to make pieces fit the way they were supposed to. It wasn't effortless. It never had been. But it was familiar in a way that felt almost like remembering a language he hadn't spoken in years. At some point, he realized he was smiling. It caught him off guard enough that he actually stopped what he was doing and checked himself, as if the expression might be a mistake. "Huh," he said again. The garage door creaked open behind him. Carson turned slightly as Kevin stepped in, blinking against the light. "Dad." Carson lowered the saw. "Yeah." Kevin glanced around, taking in the scattered tools, the partially cut wood, the sketchbook open on the bench. "What are you doing?" Carson hesitated. It wasn't a complicated question, but it felt strangely like one. "I'm building something," he said finally. Kevin nodded slowly, as though processing that. "Oh." A pause stretched between them. Then Kevin stepped a little closer, peering at the sketchbook. "That's what it's supposed to look like?" "That's the idea," Carson said. Kevin tilted his head, comparing the drawing to the mismatched pieces on the workbench. "Cool." Carson almost laughed at the polite uncertainty in his son's voice. "It'll make more sense later," he said. "Yeah," Kevin replied, not entirely convinced. He shifted his weight. "It's for, like, outside or something? I was thinking maybe the front porch." "Oh." Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, "We could use something out there." Carson blinked. "Yeah?" he said. Kevin shrugged. "Yeah, it's kinda empty." Carson nodded slowly. Okay, Kevin echoed. They stood there for another second before Kevin cleared his throat. "Anyway, I gotta get back," he said. "Stream's still running." "Right," Carson said. "Wouldn't want to keep your audience waiting." Kevin gave a small, surprised grin. "Yeah, they'd riot." "I'm sure they would." Kevin turned toward the door, then hesitated. "Hey, Dad." Carson looked up. "Yeah." Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. You gonna keep working on that?" Carson glanced down at the uneven pieces of wood, the lines that didn't quite match but were getting closer. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Kevin nodded once. "Cool," he said again, and this time it sounded a little more certain. He left, the door creaking shut behind him. Carson stood there for a long moment, the quiet settling back in around him. Then he picked up the saw again. "All right," he said to the bench, the wood, the sketchbook, and maybe just a little to himself. "Let's see what we can do." Chapter 3: Streaming Mishap and Viral Attention. Carson Green did not intend to become part of the internet. If asked directly, he would have said, with complete sincerity, that he didn't entirely understand what becoming part of the internet even meant. The internet, as far as he was concerned, was a utility. You paid for it, occasionally it failed when you needed it most, and his children seemed to live in it the way fish lived in water. Carson preferred things with weight, wood, tools, the steady, measurable progress of something taking shape beneath his hands. Which is why, on Thursday evening, he was in the garage again, sleeves rolled up, carefully sanding the edge of one of the bench slats. The structure was beginning to resemble the drawing in his sketchbook. Not perfectly. One leg had required more adjustment than he'd like to admit, but it stood on its own now. That felt like something. He ran his hand over the surface, checking for rough spots. "Getting there," he murmured. From inside the house, faint but familiar, the murmur of voices filtered through the open door. Kevin's voice, steady and animated. No, watch this. Watch this." Then a burst of noise, laughter layered with something electronic Carson couldn't quite place. Carson leaned back slightly, stretching his shoulders. He glanced toward the door, considering. He hadn't meant to listen in the other night. It had just happened. Still, he set the sandpaper down and wiped his hands on an old rag before stepping inside. The air changed immediately, warmer, thicker with the mix of cooking smells, and whatever faint artificial scent Emily insisted made the house feel intentional. Carson wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but it seemed important to her. He moved down the hallway, quieter than usual, following the sound of Kevin's voice until he reached the partially open bedroom door. And he goes for it. "No, you don't. What are you? Oh my. Okay, that was actually, what was that?" Carson leaned slightly, peering through the crack. Kevin sat at his desk, headset on, eyes focused intently on the monitor. The glow of the screen lit his face in shifting colors. One hand moved rapidly across the keyboard while the other controlled the mouse with quick, precise flicks. On the screen, what Carson could see of it, something fast, chaotic, and vaguely alarming unfolded. There was also a smaller window in the corner. Carson frowned slightly, stepping closer. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. Kevin. A live video feed. "That's you," Carson murmured. Kevin stiffened. For a split second, his hands froze over the keyboard before the game character on screen promptly did something unfortunate that elicited a chorus of dismay through his headset. "Dang it," Kevin muttered. Then louder, 1 second, guys. Uh, technical. Uh, he yanked one side of the headset off and turned in his chair. Dad. Carson blinked, caught mid-observation. Yeah. There was a pause. Kevin stared at him. How long have you been standing there? Carson considered the question. Not long, he said. Then, after a moment, long enough to see that you're losing. In the headset, distant voices burst into laughter. Kevin's eyes widened. Oh my, Dad, you're on. On what? Kevin turned frantically back to his screen, leaning closer. Chat just, hold on guys, just, okay. My dad just walked in. No, I'm not joking. Carson took an involuntary step back. Walked into what? Kevin looked at him like this should be obvious. The stream. Right? Carson said, though it was not, in fact, obvious. Kevin ran a hand through his hair, clearly caught between embarrassment and something else Carson couldn't quite place. Just stand there for a second, Kevin said. I am standing, Carson replied. In frame. I don't know what that means. Kevin groaned softly. Here, like, he gestured vaguely behind him. Don't say anything weird. Carson raised an eyebrow. I wasn't planning on saying anything weird. Okay. But now I'm worried about what you think is normal. From the headset. Let him talk. Let him talk. Kevin closed his eyes briefly, resigned. Okay, fine, whatever. He pointed toward the screen. That's the camera, he said. You're on it. People can see you. Carson leaned slightly to get a better look. A small video window showed both of them now. Kevin in his chair, Carson standing awkwardly behind him, still holding the rag. Carson blinked. Well, he said. This is unexpected. The chat, to Kevin's apparent horror, exploded. Dad reveal? He looks chill, lol. Ask him what he thinks about the play. Kevin dragged a hand down his face. They're talking to you, he said quietly. Carson glanced at him. Why? Because you're here. That seems like a low bar. More messages scrolled by. Ask him what he's doing. Is that a towel? Carson looked down at the rag. It's a cloth, he clarified. Kevin choked on a laugh he clearly hadn't planned to let out. Carson shifted his weight, looking back at the screen. Hello, he said, not entirely sure of the protocol. There was a brief pause. Then the pace of the messages somehow increased. Hi Carson, he said hello. This is iconic. Carson frowned slightly. Why is it moving so fast? Because there are people watching, Kevin said, still somewhere between mortified and amused. Carson looked at him, then back at the screen. How many? Kevin hesitated. Right now? Like, 2,000. Carson blinked. Why? Kevin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't know how to explain that in a way that will make sense to you right now. That's fair, Carson said. From the headset, ask him what he does. Kevin sighed. They want to know what you do. Carson straightened slightly. I work in facilities management, he said. Another burst of reaction. Bro, that sounds important. Respect. What's he building though? Kevin glanced at the chat, then back at Carson. They also want to know what you're building. Carson held up the rag absently. A bench. A bench. Kevin echoed. For the front porch, Carson explained. It's coming along. More messages. DIY, Dad? Wait, that's kinda cool. Show the bench. Kevin shook his head. No, we're not doing a garage tour, guys. Carson tilted his head. A garage tour. It's not happening, Kevin said firmly. Carson considered for a moment. Then, it's not that impressive yet. Kevin looked at him, something shifting in his expression. Yet, he repeated. Carson gave a small shrug. It will be. There was a brief pause. Then Kevin turned back to the screen, tapping a few keys. Okay, we're taking a quick break, he said into the mic. I'll be right back. He muted something. Carson assumed the audience and turned fully in his chair. That went better than I thought, Kevin admitted. Carson raised an eyebrow. You thought it would go poorly? I thought you'd, I don't know, start explaining pipes or something. Well, I considered it, Carson said. The sink was making a noise the other day. Kevin snorted. Carson smiled, faint but real. Kevin watched him for a second, then gestured toward the monitor. They liked you. I gathered that. They really liked you, Kevin clarified. That doesn't happen a lot. Carson glanced at the scrolling chat again, slower now that Kevin had stepped away from the game. Why? Carson asked. Kevin shrugged. I don't know. You're normal. Carson let that sit for a moment. I'll take that as a compliment, he said. It is, Kevin said quickly. I mean, it is. Another beat of quiet passed between them. Then Kevin nodded toward the hallway. You, gonna keep working on the bench? Carson followed his gaze. Yeah, he said. I think I will. Kevin hesitated. You should show them sometime. Carson looked back at him. You said no garage tour. Kevin scratched the back of his neck. Yeah, but maybe later. Carson considered that. Then he nodded once. Maybe later, he agreed. As he turned to leave, Kevin unmuted his stream again. Okay, I'm back, he said. And no, He's not coming back on right now. Calm down. Carson stepped into the hallway, the glow of the screen fading behind him. From inside the room, Kevin's voice, lighter now, edged with something like pride, carried after him. Yeah, that was my dad. Carson paused for just a second. Then he continued toward the garage, shoulders a little straighter than before. Chapter 4. His wife sees him again. The first time Carson noticed his wife watching him, he almost dropped the screwdriver. Not in a dramatic way. There were no clattering echoes or shouted exclamations, but the tool slipped just enough in his grip that he paused, tightened his hold, and glanced up. She was standing in the open garage doorway, one hand resting against the frame, her posture casual but her expression not distracted, not halfway somewhere else, just watching. How long have you been there? Carson asked. His voice carried a careful neutrality, though something in his chest tightened in response to her attention in a way he didn't entirely expect. She tilted her head slightly, considering. Long enough to see you redo that same joint 3 times. Carson glanced down at the workbench. 4th time's the charm. You've said that at least twice already. That's because it's true eventually. A smile flickered across her face, small, but real. Carson hesitated, then looked back down at the wood, adjusting the piece, checking his alignment. The familiarity of the motion grounded him, even as her presence lingered at the edge of his focus. You're really doing this, she said after a moment. He nodded once. Seems that way. She stepped fully into the garage, the soft evening light outlining her as she moved closer. Carson noticed, absently, that she hadn't brought her phone with her. That felt unusual. What is it? She asked, nodding toward the partially assembled bench. Front porch bench, Carson said. Or it will be. Right now it's an optimistic collection of lumber. She walked around the workbench slowly, her gaze sweeping over the pieces, the tools, the open sketchbook resting off to the side. You drew this. Carson followed her line of sight. A while ago. She picked up the sketchbook, careful with the pages in a way that made something in Carson soften without warning. You used to do a lot of this, she said quietly. Used to, he echoed. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she flipped a page. Then another. Carson watched her face. Subtle shifts in expression, recognition, faint surprise. I forgot about some of these, she admitted. I didn't, Carson said, more gently than he intended. Then, after a beat, I just stopped looking at them. She looked up at him then. Really looked. It wasn't confrontational. There was no tension in her posture, no accusation in her eyes. But there was something else. Something like searching. Why now? She asked. Carson leaned back slightly against the edge of the workbench, crossing his arms loosely. He considered the question, not rushing to answer it. Because I noticed something, he said finally. She waited. Carson let out a slow breath. I realized I don't have a place in the house anymore. The words sat between them, quiet but solid. Her brow furrowed slightly. That's not. He shook his head, not sharply, just enough to pause her. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I'm not saying anyone did anything wrong. That sounds like something you say right before saying someone did something wrong, she replied. Carson huffed a small laugh. Maybe. He glanced around the garage. I just looked up one day and realized every room has a purpose that isn't mine. She crossed her arms now, mirroring him without seeming to notice. The basement is Emily's, Carson said easily. And it should be. She's doing something she loves. I get that. The office works better for your stuff, he said. And I agreed to that. She frowned. You didn't just agree. You suggested it. Carson paused. Had he? I might have, he admitted. But that's kind of my point. She studied him in silence for a moment. You always do that, she said. Do what? Make it sound like everything's fine even when it's shifting under you. She gestured toward the house. We built that place together, Carson. I know. And you think you don't belong in it anymore? Carson hesitated. I live in it, he said carefully. I take care of it. I pay for it. I fix things when they break. He met her eyes. But I don't exist in it. She inhaled slowly, as if preparing to argue, then stopped. What does that mean? She asked instead. Carson glanced down at his hands, still resting against the workbench. There was sawdust on his fingertips, caught in small creases he hadn't noticed forming over the years. It means, he said, choosing his words with more care than he usually gave himself, that I couldn't tell you the last thing I did just because I wanted to. The admission felt heavier than he expected. His wife's expression softened, though the worry didn't leave it. That's not. She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. That's not fair. Carson smiled faintly, though there was no real humor behind it. It's not unfair either. Yes, it is. Why? Because you matter here, she said, the firmness in her voice cutting through the quiet. You always have. Carson held her gaze. I know I matter, he said. I just think I stopped mattering to myself. The words landed differently. He could see it on her face, the shift from defense to something more complicated. something that carried a quiet weight of recognition. She sat down on the edge of an old storage crate, the movement slow, deliberate. I didn't notice, she said after a moment. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't dismissive. It was simply true. Carson nodded. I didn't either. Not really. Another quiet stretched between them. Then softly, she said, Kevin told me about the stream. Carson winced instinctively. He did. He said you went viral, she added, the faintest hint of amusement returning, which I'm not entirely sure how to interpret. Carson scratched the back of his neck. I stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Apparently the right place, she said. He was smiling when he told me. Carson blinked, caught slightly off guard. Was he? Yeah. She tilted her head. Said people liked you. I'm still not sure why. Maybe because you're you, she said. Carson let out a small breath through his nose. That's not usually considered a selling point. It used to be, she said quietly. He looked at her then, something in his expression sharpening just slightly. What changed? She met his gaze steadily. You got busy, she said. And then we all got busy. And somewhere along the way, we stopped, looking at each other as much. Carson absorbed that. It didn't sound like blame. It sounded like an observation. We should probably fix that, he said. Her lips curved faintly. Probably. He glanced toward the bench, then back at her. You can sit on it when I'm done, he offered. That'll be functional proof. She laughed softly, the sound surprising both of them a little. I'd like that, she said. Carson nodded. He picked up the screwdriver again, turning back toward the workbench, but the rhythm of the work felt different now. Not interrupted, not disturbed, just shared. Behind him, she stayed where she was, watching. Not absent, not distracted, present. And for the first time in a long while, Carson didn't feel like he was working in a space that didn't belong to him. He felt like someone had stepped into it and chosen to stay. Chapter 5. The line gets drawn. The bench came together on a Saturday morning. Carson stood back from it, hands resting on his hips, and let himself take it in properly. The lines were clean, not flawless, but honest. One of the legs still leaned a fraction of a degree off perfect symmetry, but the structure was solid. It held weight. It had presence. It existed. Well, he said quietly, there you are. He wiped his hands against his jeans and nudged the bench experimentally. It didn't wobble. That's always encouraging. Behind him, the garage door creaked open just enough to let in a ribbon of warm sunlight, and Kevin, who stepped through it, already mid-sentence. Chat said if it collapses, they want clips. Carson turned. I'm glad my potential structural failures are entertaining. Kevin shrugged, grinning. High-stakes content. Carson gestured toward the bench. It's done. Kevin walked closer, circling it slowly, his brows lifting just a little as he looked it over. Okay, that's actually... He stopped himself as if correcting mid-thought. That's really good. Carson tilted his head. You can commit to the compliment. It won't hurt you. Kevin laughed under his breath. It's really good. Carson nodded once. Thank you. There was a short pause before Kevin reached out and pressed a hand down on the seat, testing it. It's sturdy, he observed. That is generally the goal of furniture. Kevin sat down. The bench didn't budge. Nice, he said, leaning back slightly, testing the balance. Carson watched him, a quiet satisfaction settling somewhere deeper than he expected. Told you, he said. Kevin nodded, glancing toward the open garage door. We could get it on the porch. We're going to, Carson replied. Just give me a minute. They carried it together, Carson at one end, Kevin at the other. It didn't weigh much, but the shared effort slowed them just enough that Carson became aware, very clearly, of the moment. Side by side, moving something he had made, something his son was helping place. It shouldn't have felt significant, but it did. They set it down on the front porch, adjusting it slightly until it sat square against the railing. Carson stepped back. Kevin stayed seated. Yeah, Kevin said. That works. Carson nodded slowly. From inside, the front door opened. Emily stepped out, her phone in hand, mid-sentence. And I'm telling you, it's not even about the costumes. It's the... She stopped. Her eyes landed on the bench, then on Carson, then on Kevin. What is that? She asked. Carson folded his arms loosely. It's a bench. I can see that, she said. Why is it there? I put it there, he replied. Emily stepped closer, circling it in a way that echoed Kevin's earlier inspection, but with a touch more skepticism. You made this? She asked. I did. She raised an eyebrow. Since when do you make benches? Carson considered. Since Tuesday, apparently. Kevin snorted. Emily shot him a look, then sat down carefully on the opposite end. The bench held. Okay, she admitted. It's not bad. Carson allowed himself a small smile. High praise. Don't let it go to your head, she said quickly. I wouldn't dream of it. She leaned back slightly, testing the angle. It's comfortable, she added, quieter this time. Carson nodded once. For a moment, the three of them sat there, not saying much, just existing in the shared space. The front yard stretched out before them, quiet. The street was calm, unchanged in a way that suddenly felt grounding rather than routine. The screen door creaked open again. His wife stepped out, glancing between them. "What's going on out here?" she asked. Kevin gestured toward the bench. "Dad built this." She paused. Then she walked closer, her hand brushing along the edge of the seat, feeling the surface the same way Carson had in the garage. "You finished it," she said. "I did." She looked up at him, something bright flickering behind her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said simply. The word landed differently than Kevin's good, differently than Emily's not bad, carried something older, familiar, something that reached further back than the garage. "Thank you," Carson said. She smiled faintly, then sat down between the kids, completing the line. For a moment, it almost felt like one of those old photographs again. Unposed, unplanned. Then Emily's phone buzzed. She checked it automatically, her posture shifting, her attention pulling away. "Crap, I need to go live in 10, she said, already standing. Kevin glanced at his own phone. "Same. I'm late." They stood, almost in sync. "Bench is cool though," Kevin added, already halfway to the door. "Yeah," Emily echoed. "It's good." And then they were gone. The front door shut. The quiet returned. Carson sat down slowly on the bench, his wife beside him. Neither of them spoke right away. Inside, muffled voices picked up again. Kevin's, animated and quick. Emily's, bright and engaged. Two separate worlds unfolding under the same roof. Carson leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "She asked why it was there," he said after a moment. His wife glanced at him. "What did you say?" "That I put it there." She smiled faintly. "That seems accurate." Carson exhaled slowly. "I think we need to talk," he said. Her smile faded, not into tension, but into attention. "Okay," she said. Carson sat back again, choosing his words with care. "I don't want to do that thing where I notice something's wrong and then wait until it turns into resentment," he said. "I don't think that helps anyone." "No," she agreed quietly. "I'm not upset about the rooms specifically," he continued. "Not really. It's not the office or the basement or any one decision." He paused. "It's the pattern." She listened, didn't interrupt. That, more than anything, helped him keep going. "I've spent a long time stepping back," he said, "making space, making sure everyone else had what they needed." "You've always done that." "Yeah," he nodded. "And I thought that was what I was supposed to do. Maybe it was. But somewhere along the way I stopped asking for anything back." He turned to face her. "I don't want to do that anymore." The words were calm, clear, not loud, not angry, just steady. His wife held his gaze, and for a moment Carson saw something like surprise there. Not at the content, but at the certainty. "What do you want?" she asked. Carson let out a small breath. "That's the part I'm still figuring out," he admitted. "But I know it includes having space, time, a say in how things work here." He gestured toward the house. "Not as the guy who maintains it, as someone who lives in it." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You deserve that," she said. Carson studied her face. There was no hesitation there, no argument, just acknowledgement. "I also think," he added more carefully, "that we've been running on autopilot." "We have," she said immediately. He blinked. "You agree with me that fast?" She huffed a quiet laugh. "Carson, I live here too." He smiled faintly at that. "I don't want to break anything," he said. "We're not that fragile," she replied. Another quiet settled between them. Then she shifted slightly closer on the bench. "So," she said, "step one?" Carson looked down at the wood beneath them, then back toward the house. "Step one," he said slowly, "is that I stop disappearing." She nodded. "And step two?" she prompted. He glanced at her, something softer threading through his expression now. "Step two," he said, "is that you don't let me." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "I won't," she said. The promise didn't feel dramatic. It didn't need to. Felt grounded, like the bench beneath them, something built carefully, something meant to hold. Chapter 6: Chaos, Growth, and Attempted Repair. If there was one thing Carson Green had underestimated, it was how strange it would feel to not quietly adjust. For years, adjustment had been his default setting. Something moved, he compensated. Someone needed something, he stepped aside. Plans changed, he absorbed it without friction. It had been so seamless, so automatic, that he'd never even recognized it as effort. Now, on a Tuesday evening, standing in his own kitchen while three separate conversations unfolded around him, Carson realized that not adjusting felt a little like standing in the middle of moving traffic and deciding very calmly that you were just going to stay where you were. "Dad!" Carson blinked, pulling himself back into the moment. Emily stood near the counter, her arms loosely folded, her expression hovering between determined and uncertain. "Yeah?" he said. She hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the basement door. We were thinking maybe we should move some of the stuff down there around. Make it more flexible." Carson leaned back slightly against the counter. Flexible how? Emily shrugged. Like, so it's not just my studio all the time. Carson studied her face. She wasn't defensive. If anything, she looked like she was bracing for something. That sounds like a good idea, he said. Emily blinked. That's it? She asked. He smiled faintly. Did you want a speech? I thought you were going to say no. Why would I say no? Because you said you wanted space, she said, as if that explained everything. I did, Carson agreed. And I still do. But that doesn't mean I need to take yours away to get it. Emily shifted her weight, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. So, you're okay with sharing it? She asked. Carson considered that. Depends on what sharing looks like, he said. From the doorway, Kevin leaned against the frame, arms crossed. It means we don't just take it over without asking, he said. Which, apparently, we've been doing. Emily shot him a look. That wasn't just me. I didn't say it was, Kevin replied. Carson watched the exchange, something quietly surprising settling in his chest. They were trying. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't coordinated. It definitely wasn't subtle. But it was effort. That works for me, Carson said. Both of them looked at him. Really? Emily asked. Really? He confirmed. We can figure out a setup where everyone gets what they need out of it. Kevin nodded slowly. Okay. Yeah. From behind them, his wife's voice carried in. We could put your desk back down there, she suggested. Carson turned slightly. She stood just outside the kitchen, leaning one shoulder against the wall, watching the three of them with a quiet attentiveness that had become more frequent over the past few days. I don't need a desk in the basement, Carson said gently. I need a place that feels like mine. There was a difference. He could hear it now, even if he hadn't been able to articulate it before. His wife nodded slowly. Okay. Emily glanced between them, then gestured toward the garage. What about out there? Carson raised an eyebrow. The garage. Yeah, she said. It's already kind of your space. Carson considered that. The garage had been the start. The bench, the sketchbook, the rediscovery of something he hadn't realized he missed as much as he did. It's close, he admitted. But it's still storage. So make it not storage, Kevin said. Carson looked at him. Like, clean it up, Kevin added. Set it up how you want. Emily nodded. We can move stuff around. We've got a ton of random junk in there anyway. Carson let out a soft breath through his nose. You're offering to help me clean the garage? Kevin made a face. Let's not use the word clean like that. Organize, Emily suggested. Reclaim, Kevin countered. Carson smiled. I could work with reclaim, he said. His wife stepped further into the kitchen now, her gaze moving from one of them to the next. This is new, she observed quietly. Kevin glanced at her. Yeah. Emily nodded. Yeah. Carson didn't speak, but he felt it too. New was an understatement. New implied intention, preparation. This felt more like improvisation, and not always a smooth one. Later that evening, Carson discovered just how improvised it was. He was in the garage again, sorting through an old bin of tools that had clearly not been touched in years, when the door swung open with more energy than necessary. Okay, so, Kevin began, then stopped mid-thought when he saw the piles Carson had already created. Oh, you started. I did, Carson said. Emily stepped in behind her brother, taking in the scene. 3 distinct piles had formed. Keep, maybe, and what is this? What is that? She asked, pointing to the third pile. Carson followed her finger. That's exactly the question. Kevin crouched down near the what is this pile, picking up a small, rusted tool of indeterminate purpose. I don't like it, he decided, setting it back down. Neither do I, Carson said. Cool. Throw it out. Carson gestured toward the labeled pile. That's the plan. Emily clapped her hands together once. Okay, let's do this. What followed was not efficient. Kevin was easily distracted, stopping every few minutes to comment on something he'd found that reminded him vaguely of a past project. Emily approached the process with enthusiasm but little consistency, moving items between piles based on instincts that seemed to change minute by minute. Carson tried to impose some structure. Only partially worked. Why do we have 3 extension cords for things we don't own anymore? Emily asked. Because at some point we thought we might need them, Carson replied. We haven't needed them in like 10 years. And now we're correcting that, he said. Kevin held up a dented metal lunchbox. This yours? Carson glanced over. He paused. Yeah, he said. From my old job. Kevin turned it over in his hands. It's heavy. There's probably tools in it. Kevin opened it, then blinked. Nope, he said. Just sandwiches. Carson frowned slightly. What? Kevin reached inside and pulled out a stack of old napkins and an empty container. You forgot to clean this out, he said. Carson stared. I haven't worked there in 12 years. Emily lost it completely, doubling over with laughter. Dad? She managed between breaths. You've been carrying around a lunch from 12 years ago. I wouldn't call it carrying, Carson said, defensively. It's been stationary. Kevin was laughing now too. That is so much worse. Carson took the lunchbox from him, peering inside with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant amusement. Well, he said slowly, that's unfortunate. His wife appeared in the doorway just in time to hear that. I'm guessing something expired? She asked. Kevin gestured dramatically. 12-year-old sandwich situation. She blinked, then burst into laughter. Carson shook his head, closing the lunchbox carefully as if it might somehow salvage his dignity. I think we can safely move this to the what is this pile, he said. No, Emily said, wiping tears from her eyes. That goes straight to absolutely not. New category, Kevin added. Carson set the lunchbox down with exaggerated care. Fine, he said. Absolutely not, it is. The laughter lingered longer than it should have, spilling into the space that had, until recently, been quiet and unused. Carson leaned back against the wall, watching them. A little chaotic, a little loud, not particularly efficient. But together, his gaze shifted to the cleared section of the garage floor, where the workbench now stood unobstructed, the space around it beginning to open up. Not perfect, not finished, but changing. His wife met his eyes from the doorway, her smile softer now. It's a start, she said. Carson nodded. Yeah, he agreed. It was. Chapter 7 Shared Space, Shared Life. The garage did not become Carson's space all at once. There was no single, sweeping transformation, no dramatic reveal where everything suddenly aligned into something perfect. It happened slowly, in uneven increments, shaped as much by interruption as intention. On Wednesday evening, Carson stood in the middle of it, turning in a slow circle. The piles were gone. Not entirely. There was still a lingering box shoved into a corner labeled, seasonal maybe, which no one had the energy to unpack, but the chaos had thinned. The workbench now sat firmly along the far wall, unobstructed, a clear stretch of floor in front of it. And above it, newly secured after 3 attempts and a brief argument about measuring, hung a row of simple shelves. Carson ran his hand along the edge of one. Level, he murmured. Behind him, Kevin leaned back in an old folding chair, arms crossed. It better be, he said. We checked it like 6 times. 7, Emily corrected, stepping around a box with exaggerated care. You didn't trust the level. I don't trust anything until it proves itself, Kevin shot back. Carson allowed himself a small smile. That's a concerning philosophy, he said. It works, Kevin replied. Carson stepped back again, taking in the shelves, the cleared bench, the small collection of tools now neatly arranged rather than vaguely distributed across the entire structure of the garage. It wasn't just functional. It was intentional. You want a sign? Emily asked suddenly. Carson raised an eyebrow. A sign? Yeah, she said, already warming to the idea. Like, Carson's workshop or something. Kevin snorted. That sounds like a tourist trap. Okay, then you name it, Emily challenged. Kevin shrugged. Just call it the garage. That's not a name, she said. It's accurate. Carson held up a hand, stepping lightly into the middle of their debate. I think we can hold off on branding for now, he said. Emily rolled her eyes, though not unkindly. You're no fun. I built a bench, Carson reminded her. That counts for something. Bare minimum, she replied. Kevin chuckled. Carson shook his head slightly, though the smile lingered as he turned back toward the workbench. Actually, he said, reaching for a piece of sandpaper. I was thinking of starting something else. There was a pause. Both of them looked at him. Already? Kevin asked. Carson shrugged. Momentum. What are you making? Emily asked. Carson glanced down at the surface of the bench, then toward the sketchbook resting near the edge. I'm not sure yet, he admitted. Something smaller, probably, just to keep going. Emily nodded thoughtfully. You should make something for the house. Carson didn't respond right away. Not because the idea was unwelcome, but because of something underneath it. For the house. He turned slightly, looking toward the open garage door. From here, he could see the front porch. The bench sat there now, catching the late afternoon light. For a long time, everything he'd done had been for the house, for them. But this was different. This one's for me, Carson said. The words felt steady as they left him. Not defensive, not loud, just clear. Kevin nodded once. Yeah, he said. Makes sense. Emily tilted her head, studying him. Okay, she said after a beat. But you should still, let us see it. Carson smiled faintly. I think I can manage that. The screen door creaked open. His wife stepped out onto the front porch, pausing briefly before settling onto the bench. She rested her hands lightly on either side of her, leaning back just enough to test its support. Carson watched her from the garage. She looked comfortable, at ease. She noticed him watching and raised her hand slightly, not quite a wave, more a small acknowledgement. Carson returned it. Still holding? He called. So far, she replied. Kevin snorted quietly behind him, and Carson ignored it, mostly. After a moment, Carson set the sandpaper down and stepped out of the garage, crossing the short distance to the porch. The boards creaked faintly beneath his weight as he sat down beside her. For a second, neither of them spoke. The evening had settled into something warm and quiet, the light beginning to soften in that way that made even familiar things feel just slightly more intentional. "It's nice," she said finally. Carson nodded. "Yeah." She glanced toward the garage. "You've been out there a lot." "I have." "You look." She paused, searching. "Different." Carson considered that. Good different or concerning different? "Good," she said immediately. Then softer. "Just more like you." He leaned back slightly against the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. "I didn't realize how much I missed it," he admitted. "Doing things for yourself?" she asked. "Yeah." He glanced toward the house. "And being seen, I guess." She turned to look at him properly then. "I see you," she said. Carson met her gaze. "I know you do," he said. "You just got busy." She huffed a quiet laugh. "You're not going to let that line go, are you?" "Probably not." "Fair," she said. They fell into another comfortable silence. Inside, the muffled sound of Kevin's voice rose again, followed by a faint burst of laughter. A few seconds later, Emily's voice joined it from somewhere downstairs. Different rhythm, different tone, but part of the same house. Carson listened, something softer settling into his chest. "They talk about you," his wife said suddenly. He blinked. "What?" "In their streams," she clarified. "Not all the time, but sometimes." Carson frowned slightly. "Should I be concerned?" She smiled. "Not in a bad way. A mediocre way? A curious way," she said. "Like they're still figuring you out." Carson let that sit for a moment. "Huh," he said. She nudged his arm lightly with her elbow. "You surprised them. That wasn't the goal. Doesn't mean it didn't happen." Carson glanced toward the garage again. "I think I surprised myself more," he admitted. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Is that a bad thing?" he asked. "No," she said. "It just means you're still changing." Carson smiled faintly. "At 41? Especially at 41, she replied. He leaned back again, folding his arms loosely. The bench didn't budge. "That's reassuring," he said. "What is?" "That something I built can actually hold," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "You've built a lot that holds." Carson glanced at her. "The house," she said. "Us, the kids." He considered that. "I guess I forgot that counted," he said. "It always counted," she replied. Another quiet settled between them, but it felt different now. Not like something missing, more like something settling into place. After a moment, Carson pushed himself to his feet. "Where are you going?" she asked. He nodded toward the garage. "I've got an idea I want to try before I lose it." She smiled, watching him step off the porch. "Don't stay out too late," she called after him. Carson paused halfway to the garage, turning back just enough to meet her eyes. "For me?" he asked. "For you," she said. He nodded once. Then he stepped back into the garage. Not as someone passing through, not as someone borrowing space, but as someone who belonged there. Chapter 8: A New Normal. The first thing Carson noticed was the quiet. Not the old quiet, the kind that hummed with distance and unspoken space, but something different. This quiet had shape to it. It held things without swallowing them. It was a Saturday evening when he felt it most clearly. Carson stood in the garage. The door opened just enough to let in the late spring breeze. The workbench was no longer the only thing that defined the space. The shelves were filled, not cluttered, but curated. Tools had places. Materials had intention. There was an order to it now that didn't feel rigid, just considered. On the bench in front of him sat his latest project. Smaller than the porch bench, but more detailed. Slower in its construction. It wasn't something meant to be immediately useful. Not exactly. It was a small wooden box. Carson turned it slightly under the light, examining the grain where it met at the corners. He'd taken more time with this one, adjusting, reworking, sanding edges that no one but him would likely notice. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. "You're going to sand that right through to the floor if you keep staring at it like that." Carson smiled without looking up. "You've said that 3 times now," he replied. His wife stepped fully into the garage, leaning lightly against the side of the workbench. She folded her arms, but not in a closed-off way, more like she had settled in, ready to stay for a while. "And yet, you keep staring at it like it insulted you personally," she said. "It didn't insult me," Carson said. "It's just not exactly what I pictured." She tilted her head, studying the box. "It looks good," she said. Carson let out a quiet breath. "It's getting there." She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly along the edge. "What is it?" He hesitated. "Honestly," he said, "I'm not entirely sure yet." She smiled faintly. "So you made something without knowing what it's for?" Carson nodded once. "That's kind of the point." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Okay," she said. "I like that." He set the sandpaper down, leaning back slightly. For a moment, they stood there together, not needing to fill the silence. From inside the house, Kevin's voice rose faintly, carried through the open door. All I'm saying is, you haven't seen real craftsmanship until you've seen this. No, I'm serious, Carson blinked, glancing toward the house. That sounds concerning, he said. His wife smiled. You might want to go check on that. Carson sighed, though the hint of amusement in it betrayed him. Yeah, I probably should. They walked inside together, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting them as Carson followed the sound to Kevin's room. He paused in the doorway. Kevin sat at his desk, headset on, posture forward with focus, but the screen behind him wasn't showing the usual fast-paced game. Instead, it displayed a phone camera feed of the garage, of Carson's workbench. Carson stepped into the frame before he even realized it. Kevin noticed immediately. Speak of the man, he said, half turning in his chair. Guys, this is what I'm talking about. This is my dad. Carson stopped, halfway between stepping forward and stepping back. Again? He asked. Kevin grinned. You're kind of a recurring segment now. Carson glanced at the monitor. The chat moved quickly, faster than he could track, though a few phrases stood out. Bench guy. Workshop reveal part 2? H.I. Carson blinked. Well, he said slowly. That escalated. Kevin turned slightly so the camera caught both of them. They were asking about the new project, Kevin explained. Figured I'd show them. Carson crossed his arms lightly, eyeing the screen. You showed them the garage, he said. Yeah. My garage. Our garage, Kevin corrected automatically. Carson arched an eyebrow. Kevin paused. Your garage, he amended. Carson let it go with a faint smile. From the hallway, Emily's voice cut in. Is he on again? She appeared seconds later, leaning against the doorframe, peering at the screen. Oh my God. They're already spamming, she said. Then louder, hi chat. The response was immediate. Emily? Double feature, family stream let's go. Carson looked between the two of them, then at the screen again. This seems excessive, he said. It's content, Kevin replied. That's not a sentence that makes me comfortable. Emily stepped further into the room, folding her arms. We could do something together, she said, almost casually. Carson turned toward her. Like what? She shrugged. I don't know. Show them how you build something. Carson hesitated. That sounds like a lot of pressure, he said. Kevin shook his head. No, like just normal. The way you do it. There's nothing exciting about measuring wood correctly, Carson said. Apparently there is, Kevin replied, gesturing toward the chat. Carson glanced at the screen again. Huh. His wife stepped into the hallway behind them, watching the scene unfold with quiet interest. This is new, she said. Carson nodded absently. That seems to be a theme lately. Emily tilted her head. You don't have to do it, she said. Just thought it might be fun. Carson studied her face, then Kevin's, then briefly his wife's. There was something there. Not expectation, not pressure, just invitation. He let out a slow breath. Maybe not a full demonstration, he said, but I could show the box. Kevin's face lit up. Seriously. Carson nodded once. Briefly. That counts, Kevin said quickly, already turning back to the screen. Okay. Chat. Give us a second, he's grabbing it. Carson shook his head slightly, already turning toward the hallway. I didn't agree to a full segment, he called back. Too late, Kevin replied. In the garage, Carson picked up the small wooden box, running his thumb along the edge one more time. It still wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. When he returned, he stepped carefully into view, holding it up just enough for the camera to catch it. This is something I've been working on, he said. The chat reacted instantly, faster than before. That's clean. Woodwork Dad is back. Teach us. Carson blinked, adjusting slightly. It's just a box, he said. No, it's not, Kevin murmured beside him. Carson glanced at him, then back at the screen. A strange warmth settled somewhere in his chest. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, just steady. This is something, Carson said, correcting himself. He lowered the box slightly, meeting Kevin's eyes. Kevin grinned. Emily nodded. From the doorway his wife smiled, soft, quiet, familiar. For a moment Carson stood there, not as someone passing through, not as someone on the outside looking in, but fully, unmistakably present. In his home, in his life, and in a way that was entirely new to him, seen. Carson let out a small breath, something like laughter slipping into it. Okay, he said, and this time when the house filled with sound, voices, laughter, movement, it didn't feel like noise he stood apart from. It felt like something he was part of again, something shared, something alive.